We're going to look at solving equations with absolute value in them. Just to review, the absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of -4 is 4, because absolute value takes whatever is on the inside of the absolute value brackets, the two straight bars, and makes it positive. So over here we have the absolute value of a positive number. Well, your absolute value does nothing when the inside is positive. However, when the inside is negative like we have over here, we don't get out the same thing we had inside. We got out really the opposite of what was on the inside. Okay, there we have that corrected. It's the opposite, meaning you're multiplying it by a -1, and a negative times what was on the inside, which is a negative, and a negative times a negative is positive. And we know that that's what we're trying to get to. So in other words, when you have the absolute value of something, it could be equal to the inside, or it could be the opposite of what was on the inside. So once again, to review, absolute value is distance from 0, or the origin, on a number line. And remember that distance is always positive. So here we need to evaluate. In other words, we need to take our value of 4 and just go ahead and plug it in for our x. Well, if we plug that in, we get this. Now we just simplify what's on the inside. 6 minus 8, which is a -2. Absolute value of a -2 is a +2. And then we're going to add together and we get 4.7. Now we need to go ahead and solve. When you're trying to solve absolute value equations, it's an equation because it has an equal sign. You want to go ahead and make sure the absolute value is in one side by itself. Then we want to think of it in two situations. If what's on the inside is positive, remember the absolute value does nothing. So if what was on the inside was positive, absolute value does nothing, so we don't really need to write it. The other situation is if what's on the inside of our absolute value is negative. If what's on the inside is negative, we know our absolute value takes the opposite of that. So it's really the opposite of what was on the inside, because if this was negative, we've got to multiply it by negative to make it positive, still equal to our 8. And now we just solve each one of these equations. Subtract our 3 from both sides, we get 5. Here, we can go ahead and distribute through our negative. We could add 3 to both sides, get rid of the -3. Get rid of the negative by multiplying or dividing by a -1, and we get -11. We now need to check our answers of 5 and of -11, plugging them in here for our y to see if it works. So let's go ahead and do that. Take our 5 and plug it in. Is 5 plus our 3, when we take our absolute value, going to give us our 8? And the answer is yes. It does. Since we get 8 equaling 8, we know it's a true statement. Now we got to take our -11 and plug it in there. Add our 3, take our absolute value. Well, then we get absolute value of -8, which is 8. So we get 8 equaling 8. So yes, they both do work. So let's go ahead and look at the next problem. Here we need to go ahead and continue to work with this, but you need to get your absolute value by itself. So you need to go ahead and get rid of the +5. To get rid of the +5, we need to subtract 5 from each side. When we do that, we have this. Normally, at this point, you would break it into your two equations. What happens if the inside's positive, and what happens if the inside's negative? But we really, all we have to do here is just think a little bit. We know whatever we get out of the absolute value is always positive. So the left side's always positive. However, the right side is a -5. Well, will a positive on the left ever be equal to a negative on the right? And the answer is no, so therefore it's no solution. So now let's go ahead and solve these. We have our absolute value by itself. So we consider the situation of what happens if the absolute value is positive. It does nothing, so we have this. Or if what was inside the absolute value is negative, then it takes the opposite of that, and we would have this one here. So now we got to go ahead and solve each one of these. This one here, we can subtract a y from both sides. We get this. Then we can go ahead and add a 3 to both sides, and we get y to be 11. Over here, we can go ahead and distribute through our negative to the 8 and to the y. Now we can go ahead and add a y to get rid of this y to get it to the other side, to both sides, and we get a total of 3y on the right side. Now we want to get rid of the minus 3 by adding 3 to both sides. Then we want to go ahead and get rid of the 3 by dividing 3 on both sides. And so now we get two answers. We need to go ahead and check these answers. Plug both of them into the original statement to see if you get a true statement. When you plug them in there, you'll realize that the negative 5/3 does not work. You don't get the same thing on each side. So you really only have one answer, and that's 11. So here are absolute values by itself. So we're going to go ahead and consider the two situations. If what's inside of your absolute value is positive, it does nothing, so it drops out. Or if what's inside your absolute value is negative, it takes the opposite of that. So it's the opposite of what was in the absolute value. You solve each one. So you want to go ahead and subtract a 5, divide by a 2. Here you want to go ahead and distribute through. You want to go ahead and get rid of the minus 5 by adding 5. Get rid of the negative 2 by dividing by negative 2, and we get two answers of a 5 and a negative 10. Then you once again want to check them to see if they both work. So you plug them in there, and in this case they both do work. Here we want to go ahead and get our absolute value by itself because it's not by itself. And then once again, you typically want to go ahead and do your two equations like we did on the last problems. But here we have absolute value on the left equaling a negative on the right. We know our absolute value always gives us a positive. We can never have a positive on the left equaling a negative on the right, so we know our answer is no solution. Here are absolute values by itself, so we'll go ahead and drop the absolute value, and then we'll take the opposite of what was in the absolute value. Solve each one of these. Here we can go ahead and add a 4x to both sides. Now we can get rid of our minus 5 by adding 5 to both sides. Get rid of the 7 by dividing by 7. Over here, we can distribute the negative through to each one of these. Now we can go ahead and add a 4x to both sides. Get rid of the plus 5 by subtracting 5. We get 32, and then once again you want to check your answers, and in this case only the 6 works. And we'll stop it for right now.